The call came at 2:14 in the morning, shattering the silence of my Manhattan penthouse. My husband was supposed to be in London, yet the stranger on the line said he was bleeding out in a Napa Valley resort. But the true shock was not his accident. It was his mistress standing in the hospital lobby, wearing my anniversary gift to him and demanding control of my company shares while he lay dying. My name is Elena Vance. At 38 years old, I had grown accustomed to the silence of my Manhattan penthouse. It was a sterile, expensive silence that usually aided my concentration, especially when I was preparing documents for a shareholder meeting that could determine the trajectory of Ethelgard Biotech for the next decade. The spreadsheets glowing on my laptop screen were my only company until the phone shattered the calm at exactly 2:14 in the morning. The caller ID displayed a number from California. I hesitated before answering, my instincts already pricking with a sense of foreboding. A voice on the other end, clinical and urgent, identified himself as an officer from the Napa Valley Police Department. He told me that my husband, Richard Vance, had been involved in a catastrophic single-vehicle collision on a winding vineyard road. "I think you must be mistaken," I said, my voice steady despite the sudden chill gripping my chest. "My husband is currently in London. He is there to sign a merger agreement." "I am afraid not." "Mrs. Vance," the officer replied. "We found his identification on the scene. He is currently being transported to St. Helena Hospital. You need to get here immediately." The geographical impossibility hung in the air like a noxious fume. Richard had sent me a photo of rain-slicked London streets just 6 hours ago. If he was in California, then everything I believed about the last 3 days was a lie. I did not waste time crying. I called the pilot of our private jet and ordered it prepped for immediate departure. During the 5-hour flight, I sat alone in the leather cabin, staring at the dark clouds outside. I tried calling Richard's executive assistant, but the line rang and rang until it went to voicemail. The silence from his team was deafening. It confirmed that whatever Richard was doing in Napa Valley was not official Ethelgard business. It was something else entirely. When I arrived at the hospital, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and anxiety. A nurse guided me toward the VIP waiting area, but before we even reached the door, I heard the screaming. "I need to see him. I am the only family he has right now. You cannot keep me out here." The voice was high-pitched, hysterical, and vaguely familiar. I rounded the corner and stopped dead. Standing there, disheveled and frantic, was Sienna Blake. She was our newly appointed marketing director, a 26-year-old woman Richard had praised just last month as a breath of fresh air for the company. She was supposed to be in New York. Sienna turned and saw me. For a moment, I expected her to look ashamed or terrified. Instead, her chin went up. Her eyes were dry and hard. I looked down at her hands. She was clutching a familiar brown leather wallet, Richard's wallet. But it was what she wore on her wrist that made my stomach turn. It was a Patek Philippe watch, the one I had engraved and given to Richard for our 10th anniversary. It hung loosely on her slender arm, a grotesque trophy of her conquest. "Where is my husband?" I asked, my voice cutting through her theatrics. Before she could answer, a surgeon in blue scrubs pushed through the double doors. Family of Richard Vance Sienna lunged forward before I could take a step. "I am here." "How is him? Is he going to be okay?" "He is stable but has severe internal bleeding," the doctor said, looking between the two of us with confusion. "We need to operate immediately to repair a rupture in his spleen. I need a signature on these consent forms." Sienna reached for the clipboard. "Give it to me. I will sign it." That was the moment the shock evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp rage. I stepped forward and placed my hand firmly on the clipboard, blocking her. "I am his wife," I stated, staring the doctor in the eyes. "She is an employee. If she touches that pen, I will sue this hospital into the ground." The doctor immediately pulled the clipboard back, handing it to me. Sienna looked at me, her face twisting into a sneer that looked out of place on such a young, pretty face. "Go ahead and sign." "Elena." Sienna spat the words out, dropping the pretense of respect. Sign it so he can wake up and tell you himself. You are just a wife on paper. I am the one who holds his future. I am the one who holds the future of Ethelgard. I stood by the bedside, listening to the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor that proved my husband was still alive. Richard looked pale, fragile even, with tubes snaking out from under the hospital sheets. But as I leaned closer, intending to inspect the dressing on his collarbone, my sympathy evaporated instantly. There, on the collar of his blood-crusted white dress shirt, was a smear of crimson lipstick. It was a bright, violent shade that I never wore. I felt a wave of nausea, not from grief or shock, but from sheer revulsion. It was the physical stain of his betrayal, staring right at me. A nurse entered quietly and handed me a clear plastic bag containing the personal effects found at the crash site. I took it to a chair in the corner of the room, turning my back to Richard, and began to empty the contents with surgical precision. First came his wallet, then his phone with a cracked screen, and finally, a folded itinerary. I smoothed the paper out on my lap. 2 first-class tickets to the Maldives, departing yesterday, not London, and a hotel invoice for the 4 Seasons, billed directly to Ethelgard Biotech's corporate account. He was using my company's money to finance his adultery, but the real knife in the back was a crumpled document tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket, stained slightly pink from the accident. It was a draft amendment to our company bylaws. I scanned the dense legal paragraphs until my eyes landed on a highlighted section. In the event of Elena Vance's psychological or physical incapacity, all voting rights shall immediately transfer to the CEO, Richard Vance. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a terrifying clarity. The sudden trip, the stress he kept telling me I was under, the suggestions that I take a sabbatical. This was not just a midlife crisis affair. This was a hostile takeover disguised as a marriage. Sienna was not just a mistress. She was his accomplice in a coup to steal the empire I had built. The door clicked open. Sienna walked back in. She had fixed her hair and reapplied that same crimson lipstick. She did not look apologetic. She looked empowered, as if the crisis had given her a promotion. She walked past me and stood by Richard's head, placing a possessive hand on the bed rail. He is going to be a father. Elena, she announced, her voice ringing with a strange mixture of defiance and pride. She placed a hand on her flat stomach. A real father to a son who will actually inherit his legacy, not like whatever you two have. I stared at her, my face a mask of stone. Is that so? Yes, she hissed, stepping closer to me, lowering her voice so the staff outside wouldn't hear. Here is the deal. You transfer 30% of your personal shares to a trust for my baby, to ensure his future. If you do that, Richard stays married to you. We keep this quiet. You keep your dignity and your title as Mrs. Vance. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was arrogant, yes, but breathtakingly naive. She actually believed a fetus, real or imagined, was a golden ticket. She had no idea who she was negotiating with. I didn't scream. I didn't slap her. I reached into my blazer pocket and subtly clicked the top of my Mont Blanc pen, a recorder I used for board meetings. Let me be clear, I said, my voice steady. You are asking me to transfer 30% of Ethelgard in exchange for your silence. You are blackmailing me with a pregnancy. Call it what you want. Sienna smirked, tossing her hair back. I call it insurance. Richard loves me. He wants this family. You are just the bank. And Richard is aware of this plan I asked, ensuring her voice would be clear on the recording. It was his idea to secure the assets. She lied, or perhaps she believed it. So, do we have a deal? Before I could answer, a low groan came from the bed. We both turned. Richard's eyelids fluttered open, his face contorted in pain. He tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. Sienna, he croaked, his voice raspy and dry. Where is Sienna? Where are the documents? His eyes focused, adjusting to the dim light of the room. He looked past Sienna and locked eyes with me. I was standing at the foot of the bed, my arms crossed, the damning papers held loosely in my hand. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he was going into cardiac arrest. "Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh, God! Elena, wait. Please listen to me." Richard stammered, his voice weak but his eyes darting nervously between me and the documents in my hand. He tried to reach for my arm, his fingers trembling. Sienna was only here to assist me with the merger papers. I did not speak. I simply raised the envelope containing the evidence and let it drop onto his chest. The heavy paper landed with a soft thud against his hospital gown. "Since when do logistics require a private villa in the Maldives for 7 nights?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "And since when does the company pay for a romantic suite at the Four Seasons for a CEO?" And his marketing director Richard flinched as if I had struck him. He looked at the tickets, then at Sienna, and finally back at me. The pathetic mask of the misunderstood husband dissolved instantly, replaced by the sneer of the ruthless businessman I had unfortunately married. He stopped groaning in pain and pushed himself up against the pillows, his eyes cold and hard. "Fine," Richard spat, the tremor in his voice vanishing. "You want to play hardball? The board is already with me. Elena, they know you are tired. They know your methods are obsolete. You are holding Ethelgard back with your caution. My caution built that company while you were busy playing Playboy," I retorted. "I bring the vision," Richard shouted, his face flushing red. "And Sienna. She brings me inspiration. She brings me the youth and energy that you lost 10 years ago. Sign the power of attorney. Elena, sign it now." Sienna stepped forward, emboldened by his aggression. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking down at me with a pitying smile that made my blood boil. "Face it, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You are a barren woman. You have been married for 15 years, and what do you have to show for it? Nothing. Ethelgard needs a legacy. It needs an heir. I can give him that. You are just a dead end." The insult landed with precision, targeting the one insecurity I had buried deep. But as I looked at them, Richard panting with exertion and Sienna gloating, I realized something far more important. Richard's confidence regarding the board was too high. He could not have swayed them with just charisma. He must have used money. Company money. I needed to get out of that room. I needed to be safe. I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump as if their words had finally broken me. I forced a tremor into my hands. I cannot think straight," I whispered, stepping back toward the door. "Please, do not force me. I need to think. I need to protect the family name. I need time to process this betrayal." Richard smirked, mistaking my strategy for defeat. "Take 24 hours. Then bring me the signed papers." I turned and walked out of the room, my heels clicking on the linoleum. I did not stop until I was outside the hospital, inhaling the cool night air of the Napa Valley. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang 3 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Elena, it is 4 in the morning in New York. Is Richard okay?" "Hello?" "Marcus," I said, my voice sharp and commanding. Marcus Thorne was Ethelgard's chief financial officer. He was an old friend from university, a man of numbers and integrity. He was also, complicatingly, engaged to Sienna's older sister. "I am in California," I said. "Richard is alive, but I have some news that might interest you regarding your future family." "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, sounding confused. Sienna is here, I said bluntly. She is in the hospital room with Richard. She claims she is carrying his child. There was a long silence on the other end. That is impossible. Marcus stammered. Sienna told us she was going to Ohio. She said her grandmother was dying. She was crying when she left. She lied, Marcus. Just like she is lying about the baby, I said, planting the seed of doubt early. Listen to me carefully. Richard has been using company funds to finance this affair. If the board finds out, and they will, the CFO is the first person they will blame for lack of oversight, unless you help me. Help you do what Marcus asked, his voice now wide awake and edged with panic. I need full access to the shadow accounts, I replied. I know about the discrepancies in the R&D budget. Help me bury him, Marcus, or you will go down with the ship. Choose a side. Right now. I did not return to the penthouse to weep into my pillows. Instead, I ordered my driver to take me directly to the Ethelgard Biotech headquarters. The city was asleep, bathed in a gray pre-dawn light, but my mind was operating with the cold precision of a microprocessor. It was 4 a.m. when I walked through the silent lobby, the security guard nodding at me with sleepy confusion as I swiped my executive badge. I took the elevator to the server room on the 30th floor, not my office. Richard assumed that because I had stepped back from daily operations to manage the foundation, I had forgotten the back-end architecture I helped design 15 years ago. He was wrong. I sat down at the master terminal and typed in the root administrative override code. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. Access granted. I whispered to the humming machines. Let us see what you have been hiding. Richard. I bypassed his standard email filters and went straight for the archived transaction logs. It did not take long to find the anomaly. There was a recurring expenditure labeled simply as Project Eros. On the surface, it was categorized under research and development, specifically for high-level biological sampling. But when I cross-referenced the vendor IDs with the bank routing numbers, the facade crumbled. Project Eros was not a scientific endeavor. It was a lifestyle. I opened the invoices one by one. A villa rental in Saint-Tropez for 2 weeks costing $45,000. A diamond tennis bracelet billed as optical equipment for $12,000. A lease on a Porsche Cayenne for a field consultant named Sienna Blake. You fool, I said aloud, my voice echoing in the empty room. You did not even try to hide the paper trail. You just assumed I would never look. But the financial embezzlement was only the surface wound. As I dug deeper into Sienna's corporate email account, I found something that made my blood run cold. Sienna was not just a gold digger. She was a traitor. I found a thread of encrypted messages between her and the vice president of our biggest rival, Gentech. She was forwarding them our proprietary data on the new synthetic enzyme we had spent 5 years developing. If Richard does not secure the voting rights by Friday, Sienna had written in one email, I will bring the full schematic to you. I want a position on your board in exchange. She was playing both sides. If Richard won, she would be the queen of Ethelgard. If he failed, she would burn the company to the ground to secure her own parachute. I saved every email, every invoice, and every chat log onto an external hard drive. Then I pulled up the HR database. I searched for Sienna's employment contract. I scrolled to the bottom, finding the specific addendum Richard had insisted on adding to all executive contracts last year to weed out what he called problematic elements. Morality clause. I read the text on the screen. Immediate termination without severance for any employee engaging in conduct that brings public disrepute or scandal to the company. It was poetic justice. The very sword Richard had forged to control his subordinates was about to sever the head of his mistress. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was an encrypted file transfer from Marcus. I opened it to find high-resolution scans of 3 investment authorizations that had lost the company nearly $8 million in the last quarter. At the bottom of each page was my signature, but it was slightly off the loop on the V was too wide. It was a forgery. I have the metadata proving these were signed digitally from Richard's iPad while you were at the charity gala in Aspen, Marcus said when I called him to confirm receipt. He is framing you for the losses. Elena. He wants to prove you are incompetent before the vote. He is not just framing me. Marcus. I replied, my eyes fixed on the forged signature. He is committing felony fraud. This is not a boardroom dispute anymore. It is a criminal case. Just as I finished compiling the master file, which I named the exit strategy, a text message popped up on my phone from Richard. Board meeting is at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. Sign the papers or lose everything. Do not make this ugly. I stared at the screen, a dry, humorless laugh escaping my lips. He thought he was rushing me into a corner. He had no idea that he was sprinting toward a cliff. Oh, Richard, I said to the glowing pixels, tapping the enter key to lock the file. It is not going to be ugly. It is going to be fatal. I spent the entirety of Sunday waging a silent campaign, while Richard likely lay in his hospital bed, drugged and dreaming of his victory. I was visiting the homes of the 3 neutral board members who held the swing votes. I did not go to them as a scorned wife seeking sympathy. I went as a majority shareholder protecting a bleeding asset. I sat in the mahogany-paneled library of Mr. Henderson, the oldest member of our board. He looked at me with wary eyes, expecting an emotional outburst. Instead, I placed a tablet in front of him showing the unauthorized withdrawals. Look at the trajectory of these funds, I said, my voice devoid of tremors. Richard has burned through 12% of our operating capital in 6 months. This is not about my marriage. It is about your dividends. If he remains CEO, your stock value will be cut in half by the next fiscal quarter. Henderson frowned, adjusting his glasses. Elena, these are serious accusations. Richard said these were essential investments for the merger. Richard lied. I replied flatly, there is no merger. There is only a drain. Vote with me tomorrow. Or explain to the other investors why you let the ship sink. By the time the sun set, I had secured their loyalty. But loyalty is fickle. So I took an extra precaution. I contacted a private security firm, specifically requesting a team that had no prior ties to Ethelgard's regular contractors. I need 4 men outside the boardroom at 8 o'clock sharp. I told the lead contractor over the phone, no one enters or leaves without my signal. If the current CEO tries to bring in his own muscle to intimidate the board, neutralize the threat. Back in the solitude of my office, the air felt heavy, charged with the electricity of an approaching storm. I sat at my desk and monitored the digital footprint of my enemies. Sienna, in her infinite wisdom and arrogance, had posted a photo on her private social media account. It was a close-up of a massive diamond ring, likely bought with the funds from Project Eros, captioned, New Position, New Life. The $1 million baby is bringing Mama home. I took a screenshot. It was pathetic. But what came next was devastating. My private investigator sent through a secure file he had obtained from a hack of Sienna's medical history insurance claims. I opened the PDF, my eyes scanning the surgical history. There, dated 3 years ago, was a procedure code for a bilateral tubal ligation. She is sterile, I whispered to the empty room, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. There is no baby. It is all a lie. Richard was destroying his life, his reputation, and his company for a phantom. He was dismantling our empire for an heir that did not exist. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of pity for him. He was being played by a con artist far more skilled than he was. But then I remembered his face in the hospital, the way he looked at me with such disdain while demanding my shares. The pity evaporated, replaced by cold, hard steel. I would not warn him. I would let the truth destroy him when he was most vulnerable, in front of everyone he tried to impress. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering grid of Manhattan. I looked down at my left hand, the diamond on my ring finger. Once a symbol of eternal promise, now felt heavier than a shackle. Slowly, deliberately, I slid it off. The skin underneath was pale, a ghost of a commitment that had died long ago. I dropped the ring into a thick manila envelope, right on top of the divorce petition I had signed an hour ago. "Goodbye, Richard," I said softly, sealing the flap. "You chose this." I sat down and drafted a press release. Ethelgard Biotech announces immediate leadership restructuring. I left the timestamp blank. It was ready to fire the moment the meeting ended. For a brief second, a memory surfaced Richard and I eating takeout pizza on the floor of our first rented office 15 years ago, laughing about how we would change the world. We had been partners then, but that man was dead. The man who remained was a thief and a traitor who deserved no mercy. I walked to the closet in the corner of my office where I kept my emergency wardrobe. I pushed aside the black and navy suits. My hand landed on a pristine white suit, sharp and tailored to perfection. In some cultures, white is the color of mourning, but for me, for tomorrow, it was the color of a blank slate. It was the color of a surgeon stepping into the operating room to cut out the rot. "Tomorrow," I said to my reflection in the glass, buttoning the jacket. "We clean house." The sun was blinding as it streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 50th floor boardroom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like suspended seconds before an explosion. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing the white suit I had chosen with such deliberation. It was an armor of purity against the filth that was about to enter. At 9 o'clock sharp, the double doors swung open. Richard walked in, his left arm encased in a heavy plaster cast and supported by a black silk sling. Despite the injury, he held his head high, projecting the image of a wounded warrior returning to the front lines. But it was the person trailing behind him that caused a ripple of unease among the 12 board members. Sienna walked in with a strut that belonged on a runway, not in a corporate governance meeting. She carried a leather portfolio and took the seat directly to Richard's right, a seat usually reserved for the CFO. "Good morning, everyone," Richard boomed, his voice showing no trace of the pain he must have been feeling. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. As you know, the accident was severe, but the work of Ethelgard stops for no one." He gestured to Sienna. "This is Ms. Blake. She will be acting as my special advisor during this transition period. Her insights have been invaluable." The board members exchanged glances. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat but said nothing. Richard did not wait for approval. He launched into his speech, a rehearsed monologue about agility, aggressive expansion, and the need for decisive leadership. He paced around the room, using his good hand to chop the air for emphasis. However, Richard lowered his voice to a tone of practiced concern, turning his eyes toward me. "We face a significant internal hurdle. It is with a heavy heart that I must address the elephant in the room. My wife, Elena, has been struggling. The stress of the last few years has taken a toll on her mental stability." Sienna immediately stood up and began sliding folders across the table to the shareholders. "These are logs of missed meetings," Sienna said, her voice smooth and confident. "Instances of erratic decision-making, absences that were unexplained. We believe Elena is suffering from severe burnout that endangers the company's stock value." I watched the papers slide across the polished wood. They were impressive forgeries. Richard had been busy. "Therefore," Richard continued, placing his hand on the table and leaning forward, "I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence regarding Elena's position as chairwoman. Furthermore, I propose an emergency amendment to transfer her voting shares to the CEO's office until she is deemed fit to return." The room went dead silent. The tension was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the ventilation system. Richard looked around the table, a smug satisfaction settling in his eyes. He believed he had won. He believed the silence was submission. I had not said a word since they entered. I sat perfectly still. my fingers idly rotating the silver Mont Blanc pen on the table in front of me. I looked at Richard, then at Sienna, who was smirking at me from behind her open laptop. When Richard finally sat down, expecting the motion to be seconded, I stopped spinning the pen. The click of the pen against the table was the only sound in the room. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The white suit seemed to catch every photon of light in the room, making me the undeniable focal point. I did not look at Richard. I looked at the shareholders, meeting each of their gazes one by one. "Before we proceed to any vote," I said, my voice calm, flat, and terrifyingly steady, "I believe it is my fiduciary duty to present a short report regarding the investment efficiency of our current CEO." Richard frowned. "Elena, this is not on the agenda. We are discussing your it is on the agenda now." I cut him off, not raising my voice an octave. I pressed a button on the remote control concealed in my palm. The massive projection screen behind me, which had been displaying Richard's growth charts, flickered and went black. A second later, it illuminated again. There were no graphs, no complex data sets, just a single stylized logo in neon pink against a black background, Project Eros. A gasp went through the room. It looked like the logo for a nightclub, not a biotechnology initiative. I saw the color drain from Richard's face, leaving him looking grayer than the plaster on his arm. Sienna froze, her hand hovering over her mouse. "What is this, Mr. Henderson asked, squinting at the screen. "An excellent question," I replied. This is a classified initiative," Richard stammered, standing up so quickly he knocked his chair back. "Elena, you are violating Level 5 security protocols. Turn that off, classified," I repeated, a small, cold smile touching my lips. "Let us see just how classified it is." I clicked the next slide. The screen exploded with a mosaic of high-definition receipts. They were not for centrifuges or lab equipment. They were for the presidential suite at the Four Seasons, first-class tickets on Emirates Airlines, and a Cartier diamond necklace priced at $25,000. "As you can see," I said, walking slowly toward the screen, pointing at the dates with a laser pointer. "These expenses for a research trip to Tokyo correspond perfectly with the dates Richard and Ms. Blake were actually sunbathing in the Maldives. And this invoice for biological samples? It is actually a bill for a private yacht charter." The room erupted in murmurs. "Mr. Henderson adjusted his glasses, leaning in closer to the screen with a look of horror. "But the finances are only part of the story," I continued, silencing the room with a raised hand. "You might wonder why our CEO is so desperate to remove me today. It is not because of my mental health. It is because of this." I pulled my phone from my pocket and connected it to the room's audio system. I pressed play. The voice of Sienna Blake, sharp and demanding, echoed off the glass walls, crystal clear and undeniable. "You transfer 30% of your personal shares to a trust for my baby, to ensure his future. If you do that, Richard stays married to you." The collective gasp from the board members sucked the air out of the room. Every eye turned to Sienna. She shrank in her chair, her face draining of all color until she looked like a wax figure. Richard slammed his good hand onto the mahogany table, the sound like a gunshot. "Enough," he roared, his face turning a deep, dangerous purple. This is a fabrication, a deep fake. You are violating my privacy." "Elena, this is illegal." He turned wildly toward the door where the 4 broad-shouldered security guards were standing like statues. "Security!" Richard screamed, saliva flying from his lips. "Remove this woman immediately. She is disrupting a board meeting. I am the CEO. Do your damn jobs and throw her out." The lead guard did not even blink. He looked at Richard with a bored expression and remained perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back. "They do not work for you, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his hysteria. "I hired them this morning. They work for the company, and right now, you are the biggest threat to the company. I did not give him time to recover. I clicked the remote again. A new document appeared on the screen. It was an email thread. Ms. Blake, I said, turning to face the woman who was now trembling visibly. You demanded my shares, but perhaps you should explain to the board why you were emailing our proprietary enzyme formulas to the vice president of Gentech last Tuesday. The email on the screen was damning. It showed Sienna offering the data in exchange for a senior position and a signing bonus of $200,000. Sienna let out a choked sob. She scrambled up from her chair, knocking it backward. She grabbed her purse and bolted for the door, her high heels slipping on the polished floor. She reached the double doors and yanked on the handle. It did not budge. I had ordered the magnetic locks engaged the moment the meeting began. Sit down, Sienna, I commanded. We are not finished. She turned back, her back pressed against the door, looking like a trapped animal. You cannot keep me here, she stammered, tears streaming down her face. I can, I replied coldly, until the police arrived to discuss corporate espionage. And you, Richard. I advanced on him, projecting the final slide. It was a side-by-side comparison of my signature. This is the authorization for the failed venture in Singapore that lost us $4 million, I said, pointing to the screen. And this is my actual signature. You forged my name. Richard. That is not just a violation of company policy. That is fraud. That is a felony. The board members who had been nodding along with Richard's opening speech were now recoiling from him as if he were contagious. They began to whisper furiously among themselves, casting angry glances at the head of the table. I did it for the company, Richard wheezed, sweat beading on his forehead. I needed to move fast. Elena was too slow. I did it for all of you. Do not insult our intelligence. Marcus Thorne stood up from the far end of the table. Marcus adjusted his tie, his face grim. He looked at Richard, then at the terrified Sienna, his almost sister-in-law, and then he looked at the board. I have verified the forensic accounting logs provided by Mrs. Vance this morning, Marcus announced, his voice booming with authority. I can verify that every single claim she has made is backed by the financial data. The CEO has embezzled company funds, falsified documents, and exposed us to massive liability. His leadership is illegitimate. Richard slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The trap had snapped shut. Richard looked around the room, sweat dripping down his temple, realizing the walls were closing in on him. He had one card left to play, the one card he believed would soften the hearts of the traditional men sitting around the table. He stood up, swaying slightly, and placed his good hand protectively over his heart. You have to understand, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. I made mistakes, yes, but I did it to secure the future of Ethelgard. Sienna is carrying my child, an heir, a son who will lead this company for the next 50 years. Do you really want to destroy a family? Destroy a father right before his child is born? The room fell silent. For a moment, I saw a flicker of hesitation in Mr. Henderson's eyes. The idea of legacy was a powerful drug for these old men. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. It was the only sound in the room. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thin, blue folder. I did not slide it. I tossed it across the polished mahogany table so that it spun and stopped right in front of Richard. There is no baby. Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream, and there never will be. Richard looked at the folder, then at me, confusion clouding his panic. What? What are you talking about? She is 2 months pregnant. She showed me the test. Open it. I commanded. That is the corporate health insurance audit for the current fiscal year. Look at page 5. Richard fumbled with the cover, his fingers shaking so hard he nearly tore the paper. He scanned the page, his eyes darting back and forth until they stopped on a specific medical code: bilateral salpingectomy. I read aloud from my own copy. My eyes locked on Sienna. Performed at Mount Sinai Hospital 3 years ago. For those of you who are not doctors, that means Sienna had her tubes tied and cauterized. She cannot get pregnant. Richard, not by you, not by anyone. The silence that followed was absolute. Richard froze. He looked at the paper, then slowly turned his head towards Sienna. She was no longer the defiant, arrogant woman who had worn my watch in the hospital. She was hunched over, staring at her lap, her face hidden behind a curtain of blonde hair. She did not deny it. Her silence was a confession. Sienna, Richard whispered, the word coming out like a strangled choke. Tell her she is lying. Sienna did not look up. She just shook her head slightly, a gesture of defeat so small it was almost invisible. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. I watched the devastation wash over him. He had not just lost his company. He had betrayed his wife, humiliated himself, and risked prison for a future that was nothing but a biological impossibility. He had destroyed his life for a phantom. You. Richard's voice started as a low growl, vibrating with a rage I had never heard before. You lied to me. I had to. Sienna whimpered, finally looking up, her eyes wide with terror. You said you would leave her if I gave you a son. I needed time. You lied to me. Richard screamed, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. Before anyone could react, Richard lunged. He threw himself at Sienna, grabbing her by the shoulders with his good hand and shaking her violently. The chair toppled over with a crash. It was a pathetic, chaotic scene, the CEO of a billion-dollar company attacking his mistress on the floor of the boardroom. Get off me! You are crazy! Sienna shrieked, flailing her arms. Security, I shouted, though the guards were already moving. 2 of the large men I had hired stepped forward and hauled Richard off her. He kicked and screamed, thrashing like a wild animal, shouting obscenities that echoed off the glass walls. They pinned him against the wall, careful of his cast but showing no mercy. Sienna crawled backward into the corner, sobbing, her dress torn at the shoulder, looking utterly small and broken. I stood over them, looking down with a feeling of absolute detachment. I felt no triumph, only a deep, freezing contempt. Look at you 2, I said, my voice cutting through Richard's heavy breathing. You deserve each other. You are both frauds, built on lies and greed. I turned back to the stunned board members. They looked horrified, as if they had just witnessed a murder. I believe we have seen enough, I said calmly, smoothing the lapel of my white jacket. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Richard Vance. And I moved to terminate Sienna Blake's employment immediately for gross misconduct in violation of corporate policy. Seconded, Mr. Henderson said, his voice trembling slightly. I second the motion. All in favor, I asked. Every single hand went up. It is unanimous. I declared. I looked back at Richard, who was now sagging in the grip of the guards, and Sienna, who was weeping into her hands. Now, here is the reality, I said, stepping closer to them so they could hear every syllable. I have enough evidence to send both of you to federal prison for 10 years. Embezzlement, corporate espionage, fraud. But I am a practical woman. I do not want the scandal of a trial to drag Ethelgard's stock price down. I locked eyes with Richard. You will sign over your remaining shares to cover the debt you owe the company, I told him. And you, Sienna, you will sign a confession regarding the trade secrets you sold, which I will hold as leverage forever. If you refuse, I call the FBI right now. Decide. I signaled to Marcus, who handed me the thick stack of legal documents we had prepared with the company attorneys only 3 hours prior. The room was quiet now. Save for the hum of the air conditioning and the ragged breathing of the man who used to be my husband, I slid the papers across the table, right over the spot where he had just been pinned to the wall. "This is a settlement agreement," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "It outlines the terms of our immediate divorce and the restitution for the corporate theft you committed." Richard looked at the papers, his eyes red and swollen. He cradled his cast against his chest like a shield. "Elena, I cannot sign this. You are taking everything. I am taking back what you stole." I corrected him. "According to Marcus's audit, you embezzled over $4 million to fund your lifestyle and your Project Eros. You do not have the liquidity to repay that. So, you will transfer your remaining 15% equity in Ethelgard Biotech to me as direct compensation." 15%? Richard gasped, his voice cracking. That is my entire portfolio. That is my life's work. It is the price of your freedom," I replied, uncapping a pen and placing it next to the document. "If you sign, I agree not to press criminal charges for the embezzlement. If you refuse, the police are waiting in the lobby. You will trade your corner office for a jail cell. The choice is yours." I watched his hand shake as he picked up the pen. He looked at the clause I pointed to. It detailed not only the asset transfer but the complete stripping of his titles. He was to be removed from the board, stripped of his severance package, and his health insurance was to be terminated effective immediately. Furthermore, there was a restraining order clause barring him from coming within 500 meters of any Ethelgard property. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. It was a pathetic sight. He had lost his wife, the imaginary son he thought he was protecting, his company, and his dignity in the span of 30 minutes. He scribbled his signature on the line, the ink barely steady enough to be legible. I pulled the papers away the second the pen lifted. Good. I turned my attention to Sienna, who was still weeping in the corner. She looked up, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "And you," I said, looking at her with the same interest I would show a bacterial culture in a petri dish. "You will sign a repayment plan for the $85,000 in salary and unauthorized gifts you received. If you default on a single payment, or if you ever speak a word about this company again, I will release the evidence of you selling trade secrets to Gentech." Sienna's eyes widened in horror. You would ruin my career. You ruined it yourself when you decided to be a spy," I said coldly. "If I release those emails, no company in this industry will ever hire you to sweep their floors, let alone run their marketing." "Sign it!" She crawled back to the table and signed, her hand trembling so violently she had to use her other hand to steady it. I nodded to the head of security. "Escort Ms. Blake out. Give her a cardboard box for her personal items. Make sure the staff sees her leave." "She is not to take anything electronic." Sienna was hauled to her feet. She looked back at Richard, perhaps hoping for a savior, but he was staring blankly at the table. She was led out of the room and through the glass walls. I could see the employees staring, whispering, pointing as she was marched toward the elevator like a common criminal. I turned back to Richard. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. "I have just authorized the bank to freeze our joint accounts pending the final divorce decree," I informed him. "Your personal credit cards were linked to the corporate guarantee, so those have been canceled as of 5 minutes ago. You are currently insolvent." Richard looked at me, a flicker of panic cutting through his shock. He reached out with his good hand, trying to grab my fingers. "Elena, please," he begged, his voice a broken whisper. "I have nothing. No home, no money. How am I supposed to live? We were partners. We built this together. Please." "Forgiveness." I pulled my hand back sharply, recoiling as if I had touched something rotting. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white suit. I looked down at him, seeing not the man I once loved, but a stranger who had tried to destroy me. "You wanted a new life. Richard," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You wanted freedom to be with her. I am granting your wish. You are free. You have no job, no wife, and no responsibilities. I turned and walked toward the door, stopping just before I exited to deliver the final blow. You and Sienna are both leaving here with nothing, I said. Two broke people can take care of each other. Good luck. The security team was thorough. They did not take Richard to the lobby. They took him straight to the service exit on the alley level and pushed him out onto the cold, unforgiving sidewalk of Midtown Manhattan. The man who had entered the Ethelgard Tower that morning as its CEO was now standing stranded, his arm in a plaster cast, his suit rumpled, and not a single penny in his pocket. The chill of the New York air was nothing compared to the chill of his sudden destitution. He stood there for a long moment, helpless, when his eyes caught movement down the street. Sienna was standing 20 feet away, desperately waving her free hand at passing yellow taxis, none of which bothered to stop for a woman crying into her expensive, discarded clothes. She had been ejected moments before him. Richard and Sienna looked at each other. There was no trace of the lust or camaraderie that had defined their relationship. There was only pure, venomous hatred. Richard's face twisted into a snarl of accusation. Sienna's eyes flashed with fierce blame. They were two broken halves of the same mistake, instantly recognizing each other as the architect of their mutual ruin. They turned away from one another without a word. Two small, pathetic figures swallowed by the vast, indifferent city. I watched the entire spectacle from the 50th floor window. They looked like two tiny, insignificant specks on the concrete pavement below. I felt no surge of savage joy, no sense of giddy victory. Instead, a profound sense of lightness washed over me, the quiet, surgical relief of knowing that the tumor had been successfully excised, the toxic years, the lies, the betrayal, it was gone. I turned back to the boardroom. The atmosphere had changed completely. The shareholders were energized, awaiting my command. They knew the company had been narrowly saved from scandal and financial collapse. The first order of business is to cleanse this entire organization, I announced, walking to the head of the table. We will implement a forensic audit of every single department Richard and Ms. Blake touched. I want every trace of Project Eros erased from our servers immediately. I signed the documents confirming the new leadership structure. I named Marcus Thorne as the interim chief executive officer, a position he had earned with his loyalty and integrity. I, however, would retain the chairmanship of the board, concentrating absolute power in my hands. The era of shared governance with Richard Vance was over. Just as I signed the last document, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a secure notification from the bank confirming the successful transfer of Richard's remaining equity. The message was crisp, final, and satisfying. I now officially owned 85% of Ethelgard Biotech. I gathered my files. I walked out of the boardroom and down the hall, passing Richard's sprawling office. Two facilities employees were already outside, dismantling his life. His massive, gilded portrait, the one that hung prominently in the lobby, was being carefully lowered into a wooden crate. As they tipped the heavy frame, the glass cracked with a sharp, ugly sound. I stepped around the splintered pieces on the marble floor without pausing, without glancing back, letting the shattered glass symbolize the end of my marriage. When I reached the ground floor, the double doors of the lobby swung open, revealing a horde of flashing cameras and shouting reporters who had caught wind of the emergency board meeting. Mrs. Vance. What happened to Richard Vance? Did the CEO resign? Is he ill? What does this mean for Ethelgard's stock I did not stop? I merely slowed my pace, adjusted the pristine white sunglasses on my nose, and offered a small, cold, utterly mysterious smile that told them everything and nothing at all. I slipped into the waiting black-armored limousine, the security guards forming an immediate protective wall between me and the hungry press. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving the chaos and the ghosts behind. I opened the new folder on my lap. It contained the blueprints for the next phase of Ethelgard's expansion. Projects Richard had deemed too risky. I was the queen now, the undisputed ruler of the kingdom I had helped create. I did not need a king, a husband, or a shared throne. I only needed a clear vision and a steady hand. And that, my friends, is how Elena Vance reclaimed her empire from the husband and his mistress who thought they could trick a shark. Thank you so much for listening to Elena's incredible story of revenge, corporate espionage, and finding strength in solitude. Tell me, where in the world are you listening to this story from right now? Drop a comment below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this dramatic takedown, please subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, hit that like button, and press the hype button to help this story get heard by more people.